remasters and remakes. They don't always work out well for movies, but for games, they are an increasingly requested and celebrated thing. And while I'll always prefer a modern sequel that continues a story and builds on older experiences, I'm also somebody who still has hard copies of old games ready to go, and that isn't necessarily the case for everybody. And to be fair, there's a lot of things about older games that can make them pretty tough to play now, especially if you have no real nostalgia or appreciation for their original versions baked in like I do. But regardless of whether you look at remakes as your only way to play something you missed out on, or just as an amusing way to experience an old game through a modern lens, there's undeniably value in them. To varying degrees, of course. I explored a few of these a while back in a much older video, but since then I've come across a lot more. So let's get into some of those. This version of Panzer Dragoon is a complete remake of the original Sega Saturn game, which, like a lot of Saturn games, just hasn't aged very well at all. Gameplay seems mostly intact, but perhaps a bit smoother with some new options like a new modern control style that lets you use both sticks and the option to invert the Y-axis. I find that doing that while leaving the classic control style on is the best way to play. But of course your mileage may vary. I also think I prefer the original aiming reticle, as it's just easier to tell what I'm aiming at. If you're not already aware, Panzer Dragoon is a classic rail shooter that kind of bends the rules of the genre by allowing quite a bit of movement and even some explorability within the constraints of what is still technically an on-rails experience. The original Saturn game was defined by the cool art direction and the outstanding soundtrack, and this remake mostly, in my opinion, retains all of that charm by leaving the core gameplay alone aside from adding some new options and bringing graphics into the 21st century. I wouldn't say it looks particularly impressive by modern standards, but this is going to age a lot better than the original Saturn version, so I guess that's the point. There does seem to be a streak of dissent among fans of the original game though. Some people say it doesn't quite capture the tone of the original, so if you're really sensitive to that kind of thing, you might want to tread lightly. But as far as I can tell, I overall disagree with that. I'm not a Panzer Dragoon aficionado though, so maybe take that opinion with a grain of salt. But from what I remember, this seems pretty faithful to me. So if you're a hardcore purist, then perhaps stick with your Saturn or emulation, but if you just want to play the game easily on a PS4 or PS5 or PC or an Xbox, or even the Nintendo Switch, just keep an eye out for this. Physical versions aren't very easy to come by and they're not really very cheap, but digitally, on the PSN at least, it goes on sale pretty often, so with a little bit of patience you can probably get this for under 20 bucks. I completely missed out on the Mafia series back in the day, which is probably because when this game came out, I wasn't really playing games. I was more concerned with partying and college and making mistakes. But hot damn am I glad that they remade the original 2 games for the PS4, particularly the first one.
Salieri sends his regards.
This is a great game with an above-average story and full of well-written and well-acted 1920s Mafia characters. You play a young taxi driver, Tom, as he gets tangled up in the mobster life and rises through the ranks before it, of course, all comes crashing down. In that way, it really feels like a classic mobster movie that you just get to play through. It doesn't quite reach Scorsese level, but it does come closer than I would have expected. For a remake, it looks and plays pretty good too, more or less like a standard modern third-person shooter with different guns, throwable weapons, and some melee combat, and it even has some driving sections that make the game feel a lot more open than it really kind of is. There's not much to do outside of the main story, but that's fine with me. I appreciate the focus, actually. The melee combat is perhaps the weakest part, as it doesn't really have a lot of impact and mostly just kind of plays like a glorified QTE, but hey, if Uncharted can get away with that, so can Mafia. When this remake launched, it got dinged in reviews for performance issues, but they must have patched those out because by the time I got to the game, it seems to be running really well, which I'm sure is also helped by me playing it on a PS5. Granted, the frame rate is clearly a locked 30 and the graphics aren't super impressive. As far as I can tell, there's no real enhancements going from PS4 to PS5 on this, although some of these puddles and some reflections do look damn near ray-traced. That said, I think an unlocked frame rate for the PS5 would have been a nice patch for them to push out, but as of now, I guess they can't be bothered to do that. Anyway, the shooting is solid, the story is great, and I really can't recommend it enough if you like heavy narrative action-adventure games like this. The Mafia 2 remake is also really good, but if you only have time for one of them, make sure it's this one. Cotton was another one of my big gaming blind spots for a long time, and an odd one for me since I'm a huge fan of shooters from the 16-bit era, but with this, I'm good to go. This is a game about a little anime witch who loves candy, or willows, I guess, and is apparently ready to blow away entire armies of monsters to get it. As the best retro remakes do, Cotton Reboot gives you the option to play an up-resed version of the original, or a remastered, arranged version, which modernizes the visuals and changes a few other things. And honestly, I like both a lot for slightly different reasons. The retro version is just a timeless game with a little bit of an edge to it, while the new arranged version is a little brighter and perhaps a bit more pleasing to the modern eye. Some enemies go down a little easier, and Cotton's fire is larger, and the screen is a lot busier, which kinda makes it hard to see what the hell's going on at times, and it sorta reminds me of other early 2000s era shooters in that way. So because of that, I kinda prefer the original version over the remake version, but that's the whole point of having them both here. Both styles have merit and are going to be preferable to different types of players. You really can't go wrong with either one, so just pick whatever version clicks with your sensibilities the most and have at it. You also have a time attack mode and leaderboards, which is pretty cool, but good luck with that. Cotton is a fantastic series of games that really need to be played by all shmup fans, if they haven't been already. A remaster of the sequel from the Saturn and a new Cotton game are also out and pretty easy to get on PS4 now. So what was once a really obscure and hard to find game is now easier to play than ever before, which is a good thing. Katamari Damacy remains one of my all-time favorites. There's just nothing else out there quite like it, except perhaps the creator's other two games, Nobi Nobi Boy and Watum, which are also excellent games, and I'll definitely be finding an excuse to talk about them at some point in the future. But Katamari was his biggest hit, and it's pretty easy to see why. The game is insanely unique, as you're a little alien prince who needs to roll up a bunch of stuff from Earth into giant balls to replace the stars that the king of all cosmos knocked out of the sky during some sort of drunken stupor, as one does. The game has a lot of Japanese humor, insanely good music, and a little bit of social commentary as it pokes fun at some of the eccentricities and silliness of humans in general. You really get a good taste of that by browsing through the collection and reading descriptions of things from the perspective of an alien, and it's pretty genius and funny. Some levels mix things up a little bit by rolling up only certain items, or avoiding certain things, or trying to get to a particular size, things like that. And it's just a good time in short or long sessions. No violence, not super complex, and just about any type of person can enjoy it. As far as being a remaster, Katamari Reroll doesn't really do a lot to the original game. The resolution certainly has gotten a little bump, but from what I can tell the frame rate seems about the same as it was on the PS2, and that's a big shame because I think the game would have really benefited from that. Also, all of the cutscenes and dialogue seem to have been redone with Japanese voices. Now, whether these are the original Japanese voices or new ones, I don't really know. But with it being such an overtly Japanese game in tone and style, I think it makes more sense this way. If I ever need to be reminded of just how much worse I am at games now than I was as a kid, I'll just pop in Alex Kidd DX. As a game that kinda skirts the line between being a remaster and a remake, this one does retain the gameplay as far as I can tell, but also seems to have added a few things in and maybe switched a few things around as well. The new graphics have a really pleasing style that I think works well for what the game is. But of course, it does let you switch back and forth from the original to the new graphics in real time. It's a lot like the Wonder Boy 3 remake I reviewed in the last episode of the series. So bonus points for that feature, as always. Now, it's based on a Sega Master System game, so it is pretty tough. And like a lot of Master System games, I suck at this one too. Well, at least I'm still good at Glover. Not a lot to say about Alex Kidd other than it's a pretty basic platformer with catchy music, decent gameplay, and level design. And you gotta remember, it's from a pre-Sonic era of Sega, and back then, Alex Kidd was about as good as it got for Sega people, at least in the platformer genre. The jumping physics are difficult and hard to pin down, making a lot of sections pretty dicey, and the range of his punch is really short, and probably my biggest gripe about the game. I never thought this game was amazing, but I like it enough for what it is. The rock, paper, scissors stuff also feels pretty lame now, as it really has nothing to do with skill and is just a complete crapshoot, but it does genuinely create some tension, I guess. Overall, I don't really recommend it as a game generally, but as a remaster, it's really well done. Destroy All Humans is a total classic in my eyes. The humor, the tone, the way it handles chaos and combat is just pure fun and pretty impressive for the PS2, honestly. I've always loved the movie Mars Attacks and the show Invader Zim, so once I got my hands on a game that basically combines the tone of those two things on the PS2, I was immediately hooked. Richard Horvitz is also in the game who did the voice of Zim, so that right there is more than enough for me, but now with this, anybody can play it without having to bust out old hardware. The graphics have been completely overhauled in this version, and they look great to me. It stays true to the style of the original, with cartoony-looking people and not an insane amount of detail, which is smart. Everything just has a bit more depth and color than before, and the gameplay has been tweaked to play more like a Ratchet & Clank game or something would play today. It's nowhere near as smooth or as polished as those games, but it plays similarly.
Lying down. But hey, you're a big crew now, right? You can take care of yourself.
The original audio seems completely intact, and you can definitely tell as a lot of the dialogue sounds a bit unbalanced and has that sound you get in a lot of old PS2 games where it sounds like the gain is up way too high and all the voices just kind of sound like this. So there's no hiding the fact that this is a mid to low budget PS2 game under the hood, but that's pretty easy to overlook in light of everything else. I recently just played all the way through this, as well as the remake of the sequel, and I can still say that these games are must-haves. Unless, you just don't like fun things. The remake of the second Destroy All Humans is better in just about every way, as it's purely focused on current-gen systems and PC, so it's pushing noticeably better visuals than the remake of the first one. Plus, the second game has bigger maps and better weapons, and it's just a slightly better game anyway. So, while I recommend both, if you only play one, play the second one. Ninja Saviors, also known as Ninja Warriors, is a 2D beat-em-up that's seen a lot of releases and versions over the years, but they all play pretty much the same. Go from left to right and kill everything in your way. I've always liked the game, never really loved it, and never really given it a lot of time before this remaster, and I think this is a remaster of the Super Nintendo version. The characters and levels all return, but there are some additions to the gameplay, like some new moves and a couple new unlockable characters. And I like them alright, but neither of them are game changers. Usually flat 2D beat-em-ups where you cannot go up and down and you only go left to right lose my attention a little bit quicker than the ones where you can move around a little more, but in this case it actually holds my attention pretty well. And I'm not sure if it's the music or the enemy variety that keeps my ADHD brain engaged with it, but somehow it seems to do it. And I've run through this game a few times now, and I'm pretty confident I'll pop back into it from time to time. And this version from Play Asia actually came with a soundtrack, and I'm always a sucker for those, so I highly recommend grabbing it. The music isn't amazing for the genre, and doesn't even come close to Streets of Rage or anything like that, but it is good. So it's a pretty inexpensive game, and it's a good time, and it also supports co-op. Onee Chanbara is a series that fits pretty firmly in the fan-servicey subgenre of action games, but unlike a lot of those, Onee Chanbara games are actually really good. Now, I brought up Onee Chanbara Z2 Chaos in my PS4 Hidden Gems video a long time ago for a good reason. It's an awesome game. In fact, it's better than this game. But this one is kind of important as it's a remake and sort of a fusion of the first two original games on the PS2, which I'm not even sure if those got North American releases. I've never seen them if they did. But D3 and Tamsoft have done a good job with this from what I can tell, as it does feel like one seamless story and it looks great and it plays pretty good. If you miss classic action games that don't get overly complicated with too much RPG stuff and long-winded stories, like I do, then look no further than this. The PS2 graphics have been completely redone with a more cel-shaded look, which I think will age much better, and I think it looks awesome. The animations are fluid, the visual effects during combat are super fun, the blood is bright red and gets all over everything. It's just fun to look at, it's fun to play, no real complaints here. Although I will say the enemy variety and the level variety isn't the best and can get a little bit repetitive, but all of the boss fights and the fairly deep movesets of the different characters do a pretty good job of mixing that up. You have the main story as well as some bonus missions and a horde mode if you just want to completely zone in on the combat and farm money, and there's an unlockable third character and a bunch of other stuff, so there's actually a pretty decent amount of content here, especially if you're willing to invest in the season pass or whatever it's called that gives you all the extra stuff. So while I do still think Z2 Chaos is the better game, this is still a damn good one, and there's no reason to not have both. So there you have it, a bunch of more remasters and remakes that I mostly recommend, especially Destroy All Humans and Onee Chanbara. If you enjoyed, feel free to watch my previous retro remakes video, and let me know if there's any others out there that I might have missed, and maybe I'll put them in the next one. But until then, thanks for watching.